Welcome, everybody. We'll just take a minute for folks to join this first session of the PFAS and drinking water roundtables that the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus is co-hosting with the American Academy for the Advancement of Science Evidence or Scientific Evidence in Public Issues Center, the EPI Center. I'm Lisa Hanairo. I'm with the Council of State Governments Midwestern Office, and as Director of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus, or GLLC, I'm delighted to be partnering with the EPI Center to bring this science-based programming to caucus members and other legislators in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River region. Water consumption is a key part of the caucus's policy agenda, and one of the major concerns of GLLC members is the contamination of drinking water, whether it's groundwater or surface water, and even if the water that we're talking about isn't in the Great Lakes themselves. I want to thank Rebecca Eicher at the EPI Center and her whole team at Resolve for organizing today's session, as well as the one that'll be a repeat of this session scheduled for Friday, and then next week's follow-on session to get more into the policy options and ideas for communicating with constituents about this problem. I also want to thank all of the speakers for their willingness to devote time to helping educate the region's legislators on this important problem. Now, I believe Senator Charbonneau, Rebecca, do you see Senator Charbonneau? I don't know if Senator Charbonneau is on. If he is, can we unmute his line? And if he's not, he'll be here soon and we'll have him say a few words at that time. But for now, I'll turn it over to you, Rebecca, to get us started.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you, Lisa, for partnering with us to host this series of roundtable discussions on PFAS in drinking water. And again, thank you to the speakers who are providing their expertise and experience in talking with us. I'm Rebecca Eicher, a project director with the AAAS Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues. And I just wanted to take a couple minutes to tell you a little bit about AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the EPI Center. You'll see on your screen a poll. So as you entered, we wanted to kind of hear a little bit more about what you all knew about PFAS. And it looks like all of you had heard of PFAS before joining this roundtable discussion. And a majority of you are wondering if this is a problem in your community. And what we hope to talk about today with our speakers and with all of you is to learn a little bit more about the science around PFAS in drinking water, how communities have been dealing with PFAS in drinking water, and hear some of your questions to help you move from the not sure bucket into really understanding what's happening in your community. So the next slide, please. So AAAS, or the American Association for the Advancement of Science, is the largest multidisciplinary scientific society. We have about 120,000 members. We're the publishers of the journal Science and the Science family of journals. And we've been around for about 170 years working to communicate about science and serve society with scientific information. In addition to those credits, we also have about 250 affiliate associations, so other scientific societies and associations, and approximately 3,000 alumni of the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. And those are folks who are really committed to bringing science to policymakers. So a bit about the EPI Center. Next slide. We were launched by AAAS in 2018. Yeah, 2018, what year is it? And the goals of the EPI Center are really, we're designed to provide clear, concise, and actionable scientific evidence for decision makers and policymakers at all levels. And what we're really working to do is make it easier for them to access scientific information and integrate that information into their decision-making process. Next slide. Over the next year or so, we're working really specifically on a number of environmental issues. A couple of those are listed here. So PFAS in drinking water. This is our first roundtable discussion specifically around PFAS in drinking water, but we're also working on topics related to orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells, green stormwater infrastructure, and environmental justice issues. So if any of those are topics that you'd like to talk about with us, we'd be happy to connect with you on other topics and more about PFAS in drinking water. Next slide. So today we came together to provide our first in this series of roundtable discussions, and this is our information overview. And our goals for today's workshop are really to provide you with a high-level overview of the scientific evidence, as well as community perspectives around PFAS in drinking water, to connect decision makers with scientists, as well as other colleagues addressing these issues, and then talk a little bit about how scientific evidence is available and how it's helping you in your decision-making process. And then ultimately identify opportunities and challenges that your communities are facing based on disproportionate impacts from drinking water contamination. I'm not sure if, Lisa, if we have our...
Keep going, Rebecca.
Okay, so what I actually will do now is pass this over to Abby from Resolve. So she's going to facilitate the speakers and the discussion today. And we'll talk a little bit about the agenda and just a quick walkthrough of what today will look like. Next slide.
Thanks, Rebecca. So this is Abby Dilley, and with Resolve, we're a nonprofit organization headquartered in Washington, D.C., but I am based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So glad to be part of this conversation with those of you who live in the upper Midwest. And our role today, as Rebecca mentioned, I'm going to be facilitating this session. We're trying to make this series as interactive as possible while also imparting quite a bit of information from a broad range of expertise. As you can see today, we will have presentations over the course of the first segment of the conversation today. We'll have a scientific overview and then have addressing community risks posed by PFAS contaminants, and then also some community case examples to dig in a little bit more specifically, including from a fellow state legislator and also someone who's been very involved in her community, and then also Sean Mulholland from Lebanon, New Hampshire, also to talk about what is happening with PFAS in his community. We will have time after each of the presentations to pause for questions. Sometimes we take that after one person. Laurel Schaider, for example, is going to be providing a lot of technical information, the scientific overview. And so we'll pause to see if there are any questions for clarification with the information she presents. And then we'll also have an opportunity after all the speakers have presented their information to have 15 minutes of facilitated questions and answers, and really want to engage all of you as much as possible. We're trying to put more roundness in the roundtable so that we can have a more interactive session, not only through mechanisms such as the polls, but also using the functions on Zoom for the chat box, for example, and using the participant hand raising, et cetera, to make sure that we get to as many of your questions and have a conversation about the information that will be presented today. We also want to take some time to find out, for those of you, either if you're unable to make the December 9th session, or you are, find out what other additional informations and opportunities you need or would like to have going forward, so that you feel equipped to work with your respective communities and in your locations or with your peers to address some of these issues. And then we also will spend some time to do an evaluation because we'll benefit greatly from your feedback and learning anything, additional needs that you would like to convey to EPICenter and the GLLC before we adjourn at 2:30 Eastern time, 1:30 Central. So with that, I just wanted to go over a couple more of the Zoom functions. As I mentioned, we will be using the chat box to submit questions, and we encourage you to do that throughout the presentations, because if we don't get to them immediately after a presenter, we can certainly cycle back to those during the facilitated conversation. Also, just for those of you, and it looks like people are pretty savvy on Zoom already, but if you could mute your line so we reduce the amount of background noise as people give their presentations and we have a conversation. And then to the degree that everybody is able to, as much of having your screen on, the video on, that's always helpful so that presenters have faces to present to, and we're able to engage a little bit more with one another. As you can tell, we did not allocate time to introduce, go around and do introductions, because we really want to focus the full time on content. So, but please do introduce yourself when you do ask questions or we move to that portion of the agenda. I think with that, I will pause for a second to see if Senator Charbonneau was able to join. I don't see him in the participant roster. So I will turn to Laurel Schaider, our first presenter, to go provide the scientific overview. So Laurel, over to you.
Great. Thanks for that, Abby. I would love to share my screen. It currently says host disabled participant screen sharing. So hopefully in a second here, I'll share my slides. And I guess in the meantime, I'll introduce myself. I'm a research scientist at Silent Spring Institute. We are a scientific research organization focused on everyday chemical exposures and health. And we've been studying PFAS since 2009. It still says host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay, great. All right, so I really appreciate this opportunity to kind of kick off the discussion today and to provide a scientific overview of PFAS. So I'm going to start by talking about what are PFAS, and it sounds like everyone has already heard of them, at least in some context. But what are these chemicals? What are they used for, and why are they raising so many concerns these days? I'll spend a majority of the time talking about PFAS in drinking water, talking about the sources of PFAS, what we know about the prevalence of PFAS in drinking water, and what's being done. And I'll conclude by talking about various ways that scientists and advocates and regulators are thinking about in terms of addressing the complex challenges posed by PFAS. So what are PFAS? So PFAS is an acronym that stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's kind of a mouthful. And it's a class of over 9,000 compounds. And every time I check, that number seems to increase. And the hallmark of these chemicals is that they have carbon-fluorine bonds. And if you remember back to high school chemistry, these are some of the strongest bonds that are out there. So the chemical structures just really don't break down. So they're extremely resistant to degradation. They've been used widely in consumer products since the 1950s. However, it's only been in the past 5 or 10 years that these have really emerged as an important class of drinking water pollutants. So I wanted to show you the structure of one of these chemicals. So Pfoa is one of the 9,000 compounds that fit in this PFAS family. It's also called C8. And if you've seen the Hollywood film Dark Waters or the documentary The Devil We Know, this is the chemical that was of such concern in a community in West Virginia near a DuPont plant. So PFAS have a number of characteristics that make them unique and difficult to address. I mentioned already their persistence. So they've been called forever chemicals because they basically don't break down. Sometimes one chemical can kind of transform into a related chemical, but those carbon-fluorine bonds themselves just really don't break down. They're extremely mobile in the environment. They move through groundwater, and they have also traveled all around the world. So they've been found in the Arctic, and they can bioaccumulate in wildlife. So for instance, polar bears in the Arctic have been found to have quite elevated levels of PFAS. They can also accumulate in people's bodies and are frequently found in people's blood. PFAS chemicals have been associated with a wide range of adverse health outcomes, although we're still learning about some of the newer PFAS chemicals that are being used, but there are many health effects that are pretty well established associated with PFAS exposures. And they're also extremely versatile. They have these chemical properties of being non-stick, stain resistant, and waterproof that makes them useful for many different purposes. There are other pollutants that have some of these characteristics, but I would say that PFAS are unique in having all of these combined into one family of chemicals. So PFAS are not a word that you would find on product labels. So when you walk into the store, it can be really difficult to know which products contain PFAS, but they are common in many items that we come into contact with every day. So carpets and upholstery that are coated with Stainmaster or Scotchgard treatments, waterproof apparel, for instance, Gore-Tex jackets, nonstick cookware that's coated with Teflon. There are certain waxes for floors and for skis that contain PFAS. Through our own work, we found PFAS in grease-proof food packaging, for instance, microwave popcorn bags and fast food wrappers. There are some types of dental floss, like Oral-B Glide, that are made with Teflon. And paints as well contain PFAS as well. And every day I feel like I learn about a new use of PFAS I didn't know about before. And the most recent one I learned about was coatings on guitar strings. So Silent Spring Institute has been focused on PFAS since 2009, when we first found PFAS chemicals in drinking water on Cape Cod. I'm an environmental engineer and environmental chemist by training, and a lot of my work has focused on drinking water quality, but we are also interested in understanding other pathways by which we can be exposed to PFAS, for instance, food packaging and consumer products. So this is some media coverage of our past research studies. So I'll try not to get too deep into the chemistry. I realize not everyone likes chemistry as much as I do, but I wanted to talk about the kind of different branches of the PFAS family tree. So when you have a Teflon pan, that contains Teflon. And that is basically a very long carbon chain with lots of fluorines around it. So this is not a molecule that is by itself necessarily toxic. It's too big to be absorbed by the cells in your body. And this is what we call a polymer, because it consists of many smaller building blocks put together. But polymers do raise concerns because of these smaller, more mobile chemicals that can be toxic, and different processing aids and other smaller chemicals that are used in the processing of the polymers, and that over time might break off of the polymers as well. When we're thinking about drinking water, though, most of the chemicals that we're thinking about are really non-polymers. So smaller molecules that can move around in the environment and can end up in water supplies and source waters. Some of these are what we call legacy PFAS. So I mentioned Pfoa already. Another related compound is PFOS. And manufacturers were pressured to start phasing these out in the 2000s, early 2000s. So PFAS and Pfoa aren't manufactured in the US anymore, although they are still manufactured in China. And they're still very much a part of our environment and still part of our exposure as well. So typically these are considered long chain PFAS. They have 8 or more carbons in their chain. Once manufacturers started to phase out the long chain PFAS, they swapped them out for other PFAS chemicals that are also extremely persistent, but they do have different variations of their chemical structures. So some of them are just shorter chain versions of things like PFAS and Pfoa, and then there are other variations of that chemistry as well. You may have heard of Gen X, which is one of these replacement PFAS chemicals and has been of concern in North Carolina near a Chemours production facility. So these are currently being used in products, and they're mainly intended to be replacements for the legacy PFAS. So not surprisingly, because these chemicals are so common in products and they're so persistent, pretty much everyone has been exposed to these chemicals as well. Nationwide testing by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has found that over 99% of Americans have detectable levels of PFAS in their blood. Now, one of the other concerning characteristics about PFAS is not only do they tend to stick around in the environment and the chemicals themselves don't break down, but some of them are also very long-lived in our body and seem to be difficult for our bodies to excrete. So one of the main concerns about the legacy chemicals, the ones that have been phased out in the US, is that they can stay in our body for years. So even if you stopped being exposed right now, you would still have these chemicals circulating in your body for years or even decades. The newer PFAS don't stay in our body for quite that long, but they can stay in our bodies for weeks to months. And so that is more prolonged than for other types of chemicals that we take into our body, say medications or other chemicals of concern like bisphenol A. So we have this information for some of the, really a handful of PFAS chemicals, but the behavior of most PFAS in the body has not been studied. And there are concerns that in addition to accumulating in our blood, that they may also end up in other parts of our body, crossing the blood-brain barrier and crossing the placenta into infants in the womb. And all of this is concerning because PFAS have been linked to a number of health effects. And I wanted to pause for just a second to talk about how we learn how PFAS can be harmful to our health. And we have different lines of evidence. Some of the evidence we have comes from studies in exposed populations. These can be highly exposed populations, for instance, the community in West Virginia, or it can be the general US population. These are called epidemiological studies. Other studies focus on laboratory animals. These are toxicological studies where we have a much better sense of the relationship between the dose and the health outcomes. But it can be more difficult to extrapolate the results to people. And then there are new advancing types of lab studies called in vitro testing, where cells or different types of receptors can be used in a lab, and we can learn about more about the mechanisms about how these chemicals can be toxic. And all of these have their strengths and limitations. And really, when we're able to combine evidence from multiple types of studies, that really strengthens our confidence that the effects that we're seeing are linked to PFAS exposures. So there's compelling evidence about PFAS health effects, harmful health effects of PFAS. Some of these include elevated cholesterol, thyroid disease, certain types of cancer like kidney cancer and testicular cancer, increased prevalence of low birth weight, ulcerative colitis, preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy. And one of the most compelling lines of evidence focuses on immune system toxicity. For instance, in children, there's strong evidence that PFAS exposures can make vaccines less effective by suppressing antibody production. And this is an example where we see similar evidence from studies in people and in laboratory studies. And scientists and people in PFAS-affected communities are really concerned with the current COVID situation that PFAS might be making them more sensitive to PFAS, or sorry, to COVID-19, and that it might make the vaccine, once it's eventually available, less effective. So how can we expose to PFAS, and how do these chemicals move through the environment? So PFAS are not naturally occurring, so they all come from industry to start with. One way that these often can get into the environment are a certain class of firefighting foams called AFFF. These are often used at military bases and certain airports. So we can be exposed to PFAS through consumer products. Some PFAS are volatile and can be in air, so we can ingest them. Some of them might come off of the products themselves and end up on our hands, so we might accidentally ingest them. There's still very little known about whether these can be absorbed through our skin. And they can also end up in house dust, which is a way that we often get exposed to chemicals in our home. And then we can also be exposed to PFAS through food and water, as there's contamination either through the waste stream, directly from industry, or through uses such as the firefighting foams I mentioned. So what are the major sources of PFAS water contamination? So AFFF firefighting foams, or Class B foams, are used to fight fuel fires. And so water supplies near military bases and airports often have AFFF related water contamination. Near fluoropolymer production facilities where these chemicals are manufactured, these are where some of the highest levels of PFAS in the environment have been found. There are also other industries that use Teflon in the manufacturing of other products. For instance, we'll hear a little later from the Merrimack, New Hampshire community, where the St. Gobain facilities use PFAS in the production of certain types of plastics. PFAS also end up in the waste stream. So wastewater treatment plants and septic systems can be sources into groundwater and surface water. Landfill leachate can also contaminate groundwater. And then a growing area of concern as well are land applied biosolids or sludge, which can retain residual amounts of PFAS. This is a figure from a paper in 2016 that I was a co-author on. And this paper found pretty compelling evidence that water supplies close to some of these major uses, such as military fire training areas or fluoropolymer production facilities, were far more likely to have PFAS detected. So this is a map from the Environmental Working Group, and this shows contaminated sites in places where PFAS have been found in drinking water across the country. By their most recent estimate, there are over 2,000 contaminated sites in pretty much every single state. And their most recent estimate is that over 200 million Americans are served by a water supply that has PFAS. Now, when you look at this map, you'll notice that there are some states that have a lot of dots and some states that have very few dots. And this doesn't necessarily mean that these are the locations where there is the most contamination. This is often a sign that these states are being more proactive about doing water testing. And we know that when you look for PFAS, very often you're likely to find PFAS. So that explains the different distribution among different states. It's not just reflective of the extent of contamination. And where you don't see any dots, that may just mean that there hasn't been much testing. So when we talk about PFAS, again, this is a class of 9,000 chemicals, and in different communities, there are different mixtures of PFAS, and the relative amounts of these different chemicals kind of give us a clue about the source. So I wanted to just show an example of these relative amounts of different PFAS chemicals in two water systems where firefighting foam is the main source. One of these is in Hyannis and on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, where we've done a lot of our work. And then these are two communities with an industrial source. One of them is Merrimack, New Hampshire, and the other is Hoosick Falls. And I won't get into all the chemical names, but I just wanted you to see that there's a different pattern here in terms of which PFAS chemicals are most abundant. And this can provide a clue when a water system maybe discovers for the first time that there are PFAS in the water. This can provide some clues about what the source might be. So currently there is no ongoing testing for PFAS in drinking water under the Safe Drinking Water Act. There was a testing program required by EPA from 2013 to 2015 called UCMR3. This is the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. And this was really a wake-up call. A lot of water systems discovered that they did have PFAS in their water system at levels of concern. And this was one of the things that really led to the increased visibility of PFAS in drinking water as a problem. The UCMR program, though, was limited because it only focused on large public water supplies that serve over 10,000 people. And the tests that they used were relatively not that sensitive. So we think there were a lot of places that did have PFAS, but kind of flew under the radar screen because they weren't picked up by that testing. There are some states, as I mentioned, that are doing additional testing of their public water supplies. And I wanted to mention some of the challenges to conducting routine monitoring. One is the cost. It can cost hundreds of dollars just to test one water sample for PFAS. The levels that we're looking at in drinking water are in the low parts per trillion range. And so a lot of labs don't yet have that capacity to measure those really low trace levels of PFAS. I mentioned that there are over 9,000 PFAS compounds that are out there, but most testing of drinking water is currently looking at somewhere between 10 and 20 compounds. So there are questions about, well, what's the total amount of PFAS in these water samples? And is there a significant amount of PFAS that we're missing through this current testing? So for water supplies that have discovered that they have PFAS contamination and decide to treat for PFAS, there are three common types of treatment. One is called granular activated carbon, or GAC. Basically picture a 20-ton Brita filter. It's shown here. This is the system at the Pease Trade Port in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Another is called ion exchange. And then there are also membrane-based filtration options such as reverse osmosis or nanofiltration. And for communities that have PFAS contamination, this type of treatment does raise some issues and concerns. One is the cost. It can cost millions of dollars to install and to maintain these systems. Often these are fairly small water systems, and so that places a huge financial burden on the water systems. Of all the PFAS that can be found in drinking water, not all of them are well removed by all of these technologies. So for instance, some of the newer short chain PFAS chemicals are not as well removed by the granular activated carbon over the whole lifetime of those filters. And then there's also a life cycle consideration. So what do you do with the PFAS once you remove it from the water? For granular activated carbon, that can be regenerated by incineration, but there are concerns that the PFAS may not completely break down, and there might be releases into the neighboring communities around incinerators. And for other types of treatment, again, because the PFAS are so difficult to break down, you still have to think about the long-term disposal options. So I wanted to wrap up here by thinking about how do we address this challenge? There are so many different compounds and they show up in so many different places. What are some approaches to address this challenge? So a lot of scientists and advocates are really trying to think about how to adopt a class-based approach. So with over 9,000 PFAS chemicals, we'll never get our hands around the whole challenge if we try to assess them or regulate them one at a time. So when is it appropriate to treat PFAS as a single class, or at least make meaningful subgroups of PFAS? Another concept that's emerged based on a paper last year is the concept of essentiality. So what uses of PFAS are truly essential? For instance, maybe protective equipment for certain occupations or medical devices where we don't really have a good alternative right now and they serve an essential function. And what are uses that can be phased out that are not essential? So I would think something like dental floss or fast food packaging would be considered a non-essential use because there are alternatives that can do the same function and they're really not serving an essential function in those products. And another idea I wanted to convey is the idea of using just persistence and mobility as alone is a basis for concern. Often we think about persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity, and really needing to prove that a chemical has all of those concerns before we act or take a precautionary approach. In the EU, there's a chemical regulation program called REACH, and they're considering using very persistent and very mobile as a criteria and as a basis for concern and restriction, even before we have information about which chemicals are bioaccumulative and toxic. And this applies to this really to the whole class of PFAS chemicals. So I wanted to wind down by talking about how various states are responding to the PFAS challenge. So, and Phil Brown, who will be speaking next, will talk about the kind of patchwork of standards and guidelines that is emerging right now as various states are taking action ahead of the EPA because there is not currently a federal drinking water standard for PFAS. Some states are also putting in place requirements for additional monitoring of public water supplies. Thinking upstream and thinking about sources of PFAS into the environment, some states are also thinking about requiring for PFAS testing in discharges from wastewater treatment plants or in biosolids, also known as sludge, coming from wastewater treatment plants. Other states have also taken steps or enacted bans on PFAS in food packaging and restricting the use of the AAAS firefighting foams that contain PFAS. Given that there are other firefighting foams that can be used instead. And for more information about the various policies at the state level, you can visit the Safer States website. They do a great job of tracking these state level policies. So with that, I will share my contact information here and some websites from from Silent Spring Institute and some of the research projects that I'm a part of. And thanks again for this invitation.
Laurel, thanks so much. I know we gave you a lot on your plate to cover in a very short period of time. I would also refer people to your prep materials, your preparatory packets associated with a series of roundtables. There is additional information in those. We want to do two things before we turn to Phil Brown, the next presentation, to talk about how communities are addressing risks posed by PFAS in drinking water. And one of that is to respond to a poll we wanted to put up earlier on before we get into the next presentation. And then also we're recognizing that We have limitations on the chat box. So if you want to click on the icon for your hand, we'll take 1 or 2 questions before we move to Phil's presentation. We do have one in the chat box. Is there a difference between drinking water standards and health standards for PFAS, Laurel?
So health standards is a broader term, so that can refer to evaluating how much exposure may be of health concern. So typically we think of drinking water standards as being health-based. So the goal is to make sure that the levels of a chemical in water are not likely to cause health concerns. But you could have health-based standards for food or for other exposure pathways, consumer products, for instance.
Great. One more question before, here we go. How long have we known about this problem? Does it date back to before the UCMR3 wake-up call?
Definitely. And there were scientists well before the UCMR testing that were concerned about PFAS in the environment. And certainly scientists in the industries who were producing these chemicals were aware far earlier of their health effects and were monitoring health concerns in their own workers. But we're not really sharing that information more broadly. So it took scientists outside of industry a lot longer to catch up.
Great, thanks so much. I know there'll be other questions and for you, particularly during the facilitated panel session, but given time, I think we will move on. We'll as you note from the poll results, likely is the majority of you who responded to the poll, some not likely and some unsure, and hopefully we'll give you the tools, and some tools and information helpful to making some of those decisions and moving some of those conversations forward. So with that, we're going to exit the poll and I am going to turn to Phil Brown from Northeastern University to provide his presentation. So over to you, Phil. And you're on mute, Phil.
Can everybody see the slides well? All right, so I am Phil Brown. I direct the Social Science Environmental Health Research Institute and work a lot with Laurel, Schaider and other folks at Silent Spring Institute as well. Some of our projects, as I'll talk about later, are joint efforts. This is not letting me move down as well. I'm just putting this up here because I want to show you that the kind of work that we do requires a lot of people, scientists, academics, grad students, postdocs, undergraduates, and community collaborations. So these are all slides, of course, you'll have access to later, so you don't have to look at them now. One of the things that we do in our PFAS project, which is part of our institute here, is to run this website, and it's got daily news feeds of sometimes 3, 4, 5 stories every day. And we feature materials from our conferences that we've run, which are major international events. And we have timelines of episodes in some areas, and we keep adding to those as well. When I talk about the news updates, you heard Laurel talk before about guitar strings. So my big surprise just yesterday was to learn that aerial spraying for mosquitoes includes pesticides that have a lot of PFAS in them as well. So there's no end of new surprises that we find. Our team also works with the Green Science Policy Institute on their website, which contains our news feeds plus their science and policy updates. So I think for you legislators, the policy updates there can be very, very useful. Again, with Silent Spring, we run the REACH project, not to be confused with the European Union REACH. And we have a very useful website, the PFAS Exchange, that shows you different contamination sites and states and how people can learn more. And we provide a tool for people to use this website to find out where their blood and water test levels stand relative to other groups of people and to national averages. There was a question before about how long did people know about this. The point is, for a long time, and the companies knew about it a lot. I'm not going to go over all these details, but just to show you that since the 1960s, both DuPont and 3M knew a lot, including harmful effects on people, frequently hid this from all the relevant players. whether that be EPA or the local affected communities. You can see a lot more details at the bottom of the slide. I've got some books you can look at and some websites that have a lot of these primary documents available. What I do want to make the case for, and I've been doing this really since the mid-'80s, working with community groups that have made the discoveries themselves. And it is ever since Love Canal that community groups have paved the way. They identify the problem and they do a lot with it. The classic example, if you do watch the film Dark Waters, is the case of Parkersburg, West Virginia, a family that sold some of its land to DuPont for disposal, found out all of its cows died. The long story here is that this led to a very important lawsuit with a huge settlement and a very big health study. So many of the health effects that we know came about because these communities, with their lawyers in hand, were able to push to get that evidence out there. And the result of the survey, the health survey, was to really boost the science that was going on. So much of the science that we know comes from community perspectives and community advocacy. Community groups are taking the lead. We're very happy to work with many of these groups. Locally in New Hampshire, close to us, Testing for Peace has worked with us on many projects. Laurel is working with people in Ayer, Massachusetts, as well as in Hyannis. We work with the National PFAS Coalition that's got over 24 groups. And I want to just highlight one study here that was published just last year that includes scientists and community activists around the Merrimack setting. And this is a sample of many wells from nearby the St. Gobain facility. And it turned out that 30% of these wells had contamination above the advisory level, not regulatory level, but the current EPA advisory level. And when the New Hampshire Environmental Agency conducted exposure studies, they found even more. It turned out that 28% of the people said they experienced new health concerns, and that they had multiple health concerns of those folks, most of them falling into the categories of autoimmune problems, cardiovascular diseases, reproductive disorders, and development disorders. So we find that community groups are very, very important players in doing these kinds of surveys and publishing this information, in this case, in one of the most significant environmental health journals in the field. We also want to point out that these community groups, like us, push the perspective that there are many environmental inequalities, and the environmental justice implications are very big. So when you compare Hispanic or Black or Asian populations to non-Hispanic whites, you find that there are an excess of PFAS detections. This is an example of very preliminary work we haven't published yet from New Jersey, which has a big statewide monitoring program. And we use the Massachusetts MCLs here because they are the largest number so far, 6 different PFAS for a total of 20 nanograms per liter, or parts per trillion. So it's very, very significant that there are racial differences as well as class differences here. What happens at the state level can be very important. Again, community groups with the push here. Toxics Action Center, since renamed to be Community Action Works, along with the Conservation Law Foundation, asked all the New England states to set up MCLs. And the Mass Department of Environmental Protection was a very, very good player here. They very quickly held hearings. They brought in everybody who wanted to speak, gave extra time, more than they'd budgeted to, for people to talk about their concerns, whether they be local drinking water officials or community groups or city councilors. And very quickly, much quicker than most chemical regulations, were able to, by October of this year, publish formal MCLs. And these were the largest number, as I said before, 6 of them. This is really for your reference, just to show you how many states in a few years have published promulgated standards. It's growing all the time. Some of these, like New Hampshire, have, which was before Massachusetts, the largest number, 5 MCLs for PFAS, 5 PFAS MCLs. There are at the present so many other states that are in the middle of doing this. So you see here a list of some of those states that are doing more action, and some of the ones that have already promulgated MCLs are adding further PFAS to their lists. Also, another example of what community groups can do. This was the case of New Hampshire when the DEP decided that they were going, the Department of Environmental Protection said that they were going to put MCLs out. These were the higher levels that they put out, some of them higher combined than the advisory levels that EPA had, which most people felt were not significant enough. And they promulgated eventually much lower levels because community groups brought data in from Minnesota and also got huge numbers of comments from community members around the state. I'm not going to go over this except to show you that the kind of work that Laurel and I and our teams do is we do a lot of consulting with federal and state actors here. We've testified, we've commented, we've worked on bills, we've done a whole lot. So we really understand the need for scientists and our community partners to be very involved with you all on doing this. One of the things that we've done in our PFAS project at Northeastern is a contamination site tracker. It's very, very widely used, and with our permission, you can get the data and do detailed analysis. I also want to make the case that this is an issue that involves players of every sort, whether they be firefighters or retailers or wholesalers or water utilities, scientists, community groups. There are so many people here who can be allied to work on this together. Some of the things that we're working on to help are resources for health professionals, because state agencies are often asked, what do we tell people when they find out about this? We're doing a study, including one in New Hampshire, on the economic cost of PFAS because there is concern for how much it will cost. We're analyzing state agency websites to see what levels of information they have. So what can you do as legislators? You can work with your state agencies, your provincial agencies, to help them with MCLs, because in some cases, as in New Hampshire, 3M sued the state agency, said that you put these MCLs together in such a way that you didn't provide the correct mechanism. So the legislator went ahead and passed MCLs in order to deal with that. You can do like North Carolina, Massachusetts, and Michigan, provide funds for statewide research, testing, and education and surveillance. You can learn from experts. I've got a list here, including the websites of important agencies and advocacy groups that are very, very useful. You can work with what I hope will be major advances in the soon-to-be rescued EPA to help provide MCLs there and to get rid of the confidential business information that's kept us from knowing what's in a lot of these PFAS compounds. You can work with academics and scientists like us. You can work with community groups who've always been at the forefront. And because there's so much action at the federal level, you can work with your congressional delegation. You can put money together for state assistance to the municipalities. You can work on firefighting foam regulations like California, food packaging regulations like Washington State. You can upgrade information on your websites and pay very special attention to the environmental justice implications that I've shown you a little bit about. And hopefully you'll come to our 3rd annual conference in 2022. So I'll leave you with this list of publications from our PFAS project group, and Laurel's Silent Spring Institute colleagues have published a lot more that aren't listed here as well. So thank you very much, and I hope that we are able to help you going forward.
Phil, thanks so much for all the good information. And I'm going to transition right to our case examples to pick up some of the conversation that our 2 previous speakers, both Laurel and Phil, laid out, and some potential things that legislatures and legislators can do. And for that perspective, turn to other policymakers who have also been very active in their respective communities and on these issues of PFAS and drinking water. First, turn to Wendy Thomas, who's a New Hampshire legislator and lives in Merrimack, New Hampshire. So Wendy.
Hi, well, thank you for having me here. Actually, I'm a former state rep for the town of Merrimack. And we have a unique situation here in that we have an ongoing industrial polluter. So it's not like a military base where they've used the foam and now it's remediation and cleanup. We have a situation where it's every night when they burn their garbage, our town is reinfected. And so we've had the situation. I was elected with 2 other water warriors, and we our task was to bring our town from essentially knowing 0 about PFAS to becoming self-advocates and demanding change. As a legislator, there's 3 things that you're going to need to do. One is you have to educate yourself, then you have to educate your constituents, and then you have to do the legislative work. To educate yourself, the best way to do it is just to jump into the deep end. Attend a PFAS conference, read. There's some books out there. There's Exposure by Rob Bilott. There's tons of articles that was mentioned earlier. There's websites. It can be overwhelming. Trying to learn about PFAS is trying to understand alphabet soup. There's as been mentioned before, there's thousands and thousands of these chemicals. It's important for you to keep them all straight, but it's not so important for your constituents to know the names of every single one. So we'll get to that in just a minute. And then connect with groups, local groups. In our community, we had Merrimack Citizens for Clean Water with Lorene Allen. And I've spent many, many hours working with her, understanding this material and then being able to present it. The second part is that you have to educate your constituents. That's going to be difficult because PFAS in drinking water, when you hold a glass of water that's infected with PFAS, it doesn't look any different, it doesn't smell any different, and it doesn't taste any different. And so we have had many of our residents say, I've lived in this town my whole life, I've drank the water my entire life, and I'm not sick. To which my usual response was, well, you're not sick yet, or you're just very lucky, because people are sick in our town. So the way that you educate your constituents is that you connect again with your community, and you find if there's a local advocacy group. Another good way is a Facebook page, and many of these local community groups have a Facebook page. If you don't have one in your town, you should have one, and then all of the information goes to this one repository. One of the things that we did in our town is we held a PFAS fair with DES and DHHS. And what it was is we had different tables for different topics, and people just went around and got information, and it was a very non-confrontational setting. You can join in the discussion online, send out an email newsletter to your constituents with any information that you've found. We also held viewings of The Devil We Know, or The Devil You Know, which is the precursor to Dark Water, which is the Rob Bilott story, which is the PFAS story. And so we would have a showing of that movie, and then we would have a panel answering questions afterwards. There's been a group of us, we've written not thousands, it seems like thousands, but it's not thousands, many letters to the editors. Many op-eds trying to get the information out there. You have to drive education because it's not intuitive. And as I said before, there's alphabet soup, so a lot of people get overwhelmed. So we sort of distilled it down to the essence, which is we stopped calling it PFAS, Pfoa, Pfas, all of those, Gen X, and we just called it PFAS chemicals to make it easier for people to understand. And so I partnered with the University of New Hampshire and the Superfund site in New Hampshire, and we came out with some educational material that is really distilled to the essence. What PFAS is, what PFAS chemicals are, why you should matter, and how you can protect yourself from exposure or to reduce your load. One of the things you can also do is stress the importance of testing private wells. We saw that map earlier where some of the places, some of the states have only a few dots on them. And a lot of that is because they haven't tested. You can look into if you have a local landfill, look into the leachate testing results. If you have biosolids, a plant, look into the testing for that. Another great tool for educating constituents is to collect stories, because people really relate to stories. And so I'm going to give you one right now, and it's my story. I have a private well in the town of Merrimack. I live 3 miles from St. Gobain. The state told me I had nothing to worry about. It was only people within 1.5 miles from the company that had to worry about private wells. So I went and had my well tested privately, and it was above the levels that were considered safe. St. Gobain said that's not possible because you're so far away. So they sent somebody out to my house to test my well, and they got even higher results. As a result of this, my family, and I have 6 children, my family is on bottled water indefinitely. The time frame to hook our private well, my household, up to the filtered public water is, they're telling me right now it's 7 to 9 years. So my family is going to live with bottled water for close to a decade. My children, they're adult children now, they've drank this water their entire lives. Who knows what health impacts they have. And besides that, and we're one of 700 families in my town that are on bottled water. Just think of the plastic implications for recycling from all of these families in town drinking from bottled water. It's pretty impressive. So if you collect stories like that, those are the things that really make an impact. As far as legislative work, don't reinvent the wheel. Connect with other states that have done work on this already. New Hampshire's done a lot of work. Maine's done a lot of work. Vermont's done a lot of work. Don't reinvent the wheel. In New Hampshire, just in the last year, we were able to create a commission to study the effects of PFAS on health in affected communities. We passed a bill, well, we tried to pass a bill and then it got caught up in COVID for testing private wells prior to purchase for new properties. I had a bill testing private wells regularly for rental properties and making that information available to anybody who is renting the property. As was alluded to before, we lowered the MCLs for 4 chemicals, which sounds really good, but when you think that we did 4 out of 9,000, we've got miles and miles and miles to go, and we can't keep doing that. We can't play whack-a-mole. You know, this has to be treated as a class, and we have to go after the entire class of these chemicals. We just can't do it compound by compound. We tried to get medical monitoring in, and it got up to the governor's office, and he vetoed the bill. A bill that I submitted this year, although I'm not a rep, so it got handed off to another rep, is to extend the statute of limitations for PFAS related injuries, which is a really important bill because sometimes it can take years and years and years to find out you've been affected by PFAS, and we don't have the science right now to completely know what the implications are. So that bill is going to be really important for towns and cities that are that have PFAS contamination. What my bill was doing is it's extending it from 3 to 6 years, and at least that buys us time. There should be no statute of limitations at all on these chemicals because they're forever chemicals. They'll be in your body forever. My daughters who have been in drinking this water their entire lives, who knows if they're going to have some implication when they have children. You know, who knows if their children will have learning disabilities or not. I put in a bill last term to eliminate food containers containing PFAS chemicals. Mine was specific for schools and hospitals, but I know on the national level that Senator Hassan and Representative Debbie Dingell are thinking about putting legislation forward on that to just get rid of all food containers. Another bill that we got in was to create a registry of firefighting PFAS foam dispersal. And then another bill that we got in was simply to raise fines for polluting. So as a legislator, it's really important to reach out to your federal delegation to see what they're doing on a national level. I know that the Biden administration is going to put a lot of emphasis on PFAS, which is really good to hear. And EPA is going to be resurrected, thank God. So it's really important to be in touch with them. And then I just wanted to give you a word of warning as a legislator. You've got to pick your battles. You can't do everything, and you've got to be careful how you present the information, because you will be accused of fear mongering, which is what we were accused of, and of, you know, lowering household property values. In our town, one of my big concerns, and I raise it occasionally, I raise it to the right community and the right people when it's appropriate, is I'm very concerned about PFAS in our produce and our meat and our eggs. We're an agricultural community. I'm also very aware that if I make too much of a stink about that, that we have local businesses that could be run out of business. And so you have to fight your battles and choose which ones. I don't think our town is ready to hear that food could potentially be contaminated, and that's an issue, you know, and that's a judgment call, and we'll get there eventually. But right now they're dealing with the water, and we've made tremendous progress on that. So I think that's all I have for my work, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
Wendy, thanks so much. I'm sure we'll have questions for you during the facilitated session. I'm going to turn right now to Sean Mulholland, who's the city manager of Lebanon, New Hampshire, for his experiences and insights. So Sean, over to you.
Okay. It should be up on your screen, correct? You see the PowerPoint presentation?
Nope, not there yet.
Okay.
Now it is.
Excellent. Okay. So I'm the city manager for the city of Lebanon. I'm going to go through this rather quickly so you have opportunities to ask questions that you might have. So our situation is, with the city has a landfill that serves two different states, state of Vermont, state of New Hampshire, about 90,000 people, 22 municipalities. The issue that we have is the leachate from the landfill has around 70 parts per trillion of one of the PFAS compounds. I won't try to pronounce it for you to save you the time and twist my tongue. Obviously it's a very high rate. It's much higher than the standards that have been set by our state. Definitely a problem. However, that leachate travels down the street through a pipe to our wastewater treatment plant, and the resultant discharge from the plant is 15.6 parts per trillion of Pfoa, which is a slightly different compound. The compound that has 1,700 parts per trillion is actually eliminated completely through the process. We don't know how that happens, but it does. But nonetheless, that material is obviously going someplace. It's going to the sludge. That's what we think anyway. It's got to go someplace. That's where we think it goes. The sludge takes the trip right back to the wastewater treatment plant. So it has this circuit where it goes round and round and round. Again, with some of that PFAS going into the Connecticut River, which impacts people in the state of Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. So that's a big concern for us, because we're contaminating other people. And obviously we don't want to be doing that. We also have test wells from our unlined landfill. We have a lined landfill and an unlined landfill with 58 parts per trillion of PFOA compounds. Our drinking water has no PFAS in it, at least for now, fortunately for us. So again, we have an unlined portion of our landfill. That is where we think a lot of our problems are occurring from, for at least for the test well. Of course, the lined landfill is where the leachate is coming from. And the suspects, we think of that source of contamination is automobile shredder residue, which is a big issue for us. We've stopped taking that for now. We plan to be taking it again in the future, but that we think is one of the major sources, the plastics that are in that residue. General consumer waste products containing PFAS compounds. And again, that waste cycle I talked about, we're just circulating those contaminants around and around. They go down to the wastewater treatment plant and they come back in the form of sludge. That sludge gets reapplied in some cases to the top of the landfill. So we have rainwater that comes down, it leaches that material into the runoff water. And of course, the landfill, like a lot of places, is near the river, which is rather unfortunate for us. So we've got a problem that we have to deal with and that we are going to deal with. So on mitigation strategy, again, we stopped taking the auto shredder residue, at least temporarily. Our plan is to reclaim the unlined landfill and line that landfill for future use. And that way we can at least contain these chemicals. And of course, who knows what chemicals we'll be dealing with in the future that are in that material yet to be discovered. Our plan is to treat that landfill leachate by removing those PFAS compounds. We have a project that we're starting in 2021, and we plan to do that. We're not actually required to do that, even with the new legislation that comes in, because there is no standards for sludge in our state yet. But we're going to get ahead of that, and we're going to treat that water before it goes in and contaminates other people south of us.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but your slides are not advancing. If you are advancing them, it may need to go to full screen and then advance them.
Okay. Which one are you on now? Mitigation strategy?
Right now we're on your first slide.
Okay.
Sorry about that, but I wanted to be sure we saw your slides.
How about now?
Yes, they are moving now. Perfect. Right now we're on mitigation strategy.
Okay.
Thank you.
So again, our plan is to treat that leachate. We're going to get ahead of that. We're not required to do that by state requirements, at least not yet, but we're again going to get way ahead of that curve and start doing that. And we're going to be doing it on our own dime for right now, but I'll talk about where our state's starting to get ahead of the game as well and provide some resources to us. We're also going to consider becoming a regional leachate treatment facility. Right now, we have landfills. They have no place to bring their leachate. And we're proposing that we'll take it here. If we're going to treat ours, we might as well treat the rest as well at the cost it would cost us to do that. Someone has to do that. Nobody is doing that in our state right now. So our plan is to be the leader on that issue. And then state aid to municipalities. Our state has put together a $50 million low interest loan fund that municipalities will be able to draw from to deal with mitigation of PFAS compounds. The state also has sued several of the makers of these compounds. If they're successful, the program will allow for 50% loan forgiveness, again, if the state's successful, whenever that might happen in the future. But at least for now, we do have low interest loans, which is certainly helpful. Grants will be better, but there was not a whole lot of money to go around for a lot of things. We all understand that. And it's a problem we're going to deal with, and this will help us to do that. The state also has a bid price that we can all take advantage of for PFAS testing, which also helps us to reduce those costs. And also technical assistance. We have a very good relationship with our Department of Environmental Services. They're really good to work with, but this is relatively new for them as well. And they're not a big organization. We're a small state. They're doing the best they can with what they have. And it's not enough right now, but hopefully in the future it will be. They'll have better resources for us. So right now, for the most part, we are kind of left to our own to find our own solutions. But it would be more helpful if that agency had more resources to do that. And again, that's not a criticism of them. I've got a lot of respect for them, but they just don't have the funds to get us where we need to be, to help us get us where we need to be. So we're going to strike off on our own and find some solutions ourselves until they're able to help us in a better way. That's a real quick down and dirty. I know we're running out of time, and that's why I decided to do that as quickly as possible.
Sean, thank you so much. I know you have a lot of information and insights based on your experience. I want to open it up to the full range of questions for all of our presenters today. And while I do that, or you signal that you do have a question, either by raising your hand, or if you can access the chat box, please do that. But also want to pause for a second. Senator Charbonneau has joined us, and want to turn to him for his hello.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry for the technical difficulties that I had getting logged on, but my welcome is going to be close to a goodbye, I guess, but that's okay. At our meeting in October, we focused on the PFAS contamination, and I think most everybody involved was saying to themselves, boy, I'm glad I'm not Michigan, because they really got problems. And when we got around to really understanding what was going on, it wasn't that they were the only ones with problems. They were the only ones that were aggressively going out and looking to find out where they were going to need to do something. And that was kind of a sobering reality for us, and recognize that the caucus may need to relook at this and maybe reprioritize what we're going to be doing in the coming year. Had a lot of questions at the caucus meeting on the 9th, and I still look forward today to the many questions, hopefully, that will come. I think Laurel and Phil and Wendy and Sean did a pretty remarkable job of kind of focusing on what I hoped we would do today, and that's get a better sense of three things. What's the problem? What's it going to take to fix it? And how can we as legislators play a role in making that happen? So thank you for the presentations, and I'll turn it back over to you. And again, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks so much, Senator. So I do want to point to the fact that in the chat box is the link to your briefing book, and that is an opportunity to access some additional information for your more leisurely review. And also want to encourage people, we do have another session on this Friday, and then also on the 9th. As a follow-on. So I want to go to Jennifer French, and then also encourage others of you who do have questions for the panelists to raise your hands or and indicate that you'd like to ask some questions. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all of the presenters. I have been hearing about PFAS as a member of this, the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus. But it's interesting. Every time I hear it, I pick up something different, even if it's a repeat, because it's obviously quite insidious. And you know, I was one of the ones to say unsure about or unlikely whether my local community would take this on, because it's, you know, it's something that isn't part of the broader understanding. I wanted to get really specific. As a member of the caucus, we've had the opportunity, of course, pre-COVID, to travel and do some on-site learning. Specifically, back in October of 2019, we toured the NEFCO biosolids dryer facility in Detroit. It's the largest in North America, you know, all very impressive. We did a tour there. It dries the biosolids from the Great Lakes Water Authority's wastewater sludge in Detroit. So it made quite an impression on me. Obviously, you know, the massive operation is quite, I'll use the term impressive, obviously. But being the only representative from Ontario there, all of those Class A pellets of biosolids, basically their only customer was Ontario. My understanding is not government, but farmers or some distributor takes all of the trucks and trucks and trucks of these biosolids from the sludge from Detroit. So sewer and, you know, road and toilets and whatever else, what have you. And it's being applied in Ontario. So as a legislator here, I have tried to gather kind of some research, very preliminary, but I can't shake it. I can't shake that, you know, we have all of these biosolids being applied to our farms and communities as a, you know, cost effective, I'm going to say. I don't know whether it's effective as a fertilizer, but a cost effective fertilizer. We're getting all of Detroit's Class A pellets, which is a euphemism for what I'm trying to say. But my concern also is when we were on site asking questions at the dryer, they said to us that they were not yet testing for PFAS. So somebody, you know, one of the other legislators that I was there had the presence of mind to ask this. And I was like, oh, I wonder what that means. And they weren't testing for that. So with all of these cross-jurisdictional things and you know, it's hard to keep your eye on the ball when there's so much happening. So I guess asking this team, where do we go from here? Is there kind of a testing? I hate the idea of these forever chemicals being put in our beautiful, you know, food producing soil if it's not being managed, or I shouldn't say managed. I just don't know. So please advise, because I'm more than happy to share that with my colleagues here in the legislature and the government and whatnot. But I would appreciate that.
Thanks very much for the question, Jennifer. Laurel, you touched on some of the testing protocols. Do you want to start with that question? And then Wendy, you raised the issue of concern about food contamination, so you may want to touch on that as well. So Laurel, I'll turn to you first and then to Wendy.
Okay, sure. Thanks for that question. And I think it raises a really important point about having these very persistent chemicals in use. You know, when you buy Class A biosolids, you know, that means it doesn't have a lot of heavy metals. It doesn't have a lot of the things that we know to look for, but it might have PFAS. You wouldn't know if you're not testing for it. I haven't seen a lot of states really doing much on this yet. There was a dairy farmer in Maine who had high levels of PFAS in his milk that his cows were producing. And that seemed to be not just from sort of regular sludge, but sludge from a paper mill. PFAS are used to make grease-proof papers. So Maine, that kind of put a spotlight on the issue, and Maine is doing testing of PFAS and residuals, and I believe they have a screening level. Right now, I'm part of a technical work group that's advising the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. Sounds like they are hoping to set a screening level for PFAS and sludge. It's tricky, right? Because when you're talking about PFAS and water, you can say like, okay, we'll make an estimate of how much water people take in. What do we think of level of ingestion is acceptable? And you can do the math and figure out what that means for a water concentration. And sludge is a lot more complicated because you're mixing it into the soil. So the discussions are talking about like, you know, protecting the groundwater underneath that and how much sludge gets mixed into how much soil over what period of time. And it's very difficult. So far, they're not yet addressing the direct uptake of PFAS into plants, but that's certainly a concern, as well as the leaching into groundwater. So I'm not aware of other states. There might be others on the call that know more about what's going on in their state, but those are the two states that I know about. But this is just sort of starting to become an issue. I believe that Michigan is also doing testing of effluent from wastewater treatment plants. So that gives you a clue about which wastewater treatment plants might be receiving, you know, discharges from an industry and have sort of above average levels. But I feel like we're just starting to move beyond the AAAF firefighting foam sites and thinking about like, what are the other sources of PFAS?
Well, and just further to that, because the direct uptake into the plants or the runoff into the drinking water, those are obvious sort of as we're having this discussion. But where I get stuck as well is we have beautiful farmland, you know, and really, you know, rich. And those of us who have it are very proud to have it. So the idea of it being a forever chemical that stays in the soil, and I'd be interested in kind of the soil studies as they start of that cumulative or residual impact, which makes me really, really nervous in terms of the, you know, what does that do to the soil, not just the produce from the soil.
Yeah. And I'll just add that one of the concerns about the newer PFAS chemicals, the ones that don't accumulate in our bodies for as long, they tend to be just a little more mobile. So they're harder to remove from drinking water, and they seem more readily absorbed by plants. So not just kind of getting stuck in the roots, but potentially being taken up into the shoots and the fruits that might be the edible parts of the plant. So
Wendy, you had expressed some concern about contamination on food, and I'm not sure if you had any additional insight to where that may be coming from or how to test for it, et cetera, along the lines of Jennifer's question. And then I want to go to one or two more questions before we need to move towards other parts of the conversation.
Sure. In Merrimack, because they burn every night, it goes up into the air. And so our soil is contaminated by a particulate that comes down from soot and things like that. And then it's taken up by the plants. If you don't test, you don't know it's there. So that's the first thing. You can suspect all you want, but if you don't have the testing results, no one is going to believe you. And even if you get the testing results, be prepared for a lot of pushback, because if you prove that soil is contaminated, if you prove that food is contaminated, if you prove that biosolids are contaminated, that means somebody has to do remediation. And usually it's the business that's associated with that, and remediation costs money. So our biggest opponents in this whole debate, this whole discussion, this whole war, is the business industry and the lobbyists. They really pushed back on us a lot. So, you know, in the United States, we don't have soil standards. We don't have biosolid standards yet. We're hoping to get there. Europe has done a lot of work on this, and actually that's where I saw some really good data on food contamination. So I would look to there. But if in the United States, if you don't have the testing results, you're not going to get very far.
Thank you, Wendy. So we have a question from Steve Sindel, and this may go to what you just mentioned in terms of where some of the pushback is coming from, but he wanted to know where opposition to PFAS mitigation and management in individual states has come from, and what's been their objection. So that's open to any of the panelists who want to address that. And then we'll need to move on to portions of the discussion for additional information that would be useful, but wanted to see who would like to take up that question. Wendy, you want to start?
Sarah, I can start. The chemical industry had big lobbyists that were pushing against all of our bills. The business lobbyists were pushing against everything. Water associations were pushing, not because they didn't recognize that it was detrimental to health, but because they realized that there was going to be a huge remediation cost involved. In fact, our town, we had a town warrant to, I think it was $4 million that the taxpayers decided to put onto ourselves for filtering our water, because it wasn't going to get done any other way. And that has a lot to say about our educational program, because to get a town to vote for $4 million cost was huge. It was huge. But it's going to cost money. So really, any lobbyist or any group that's pro-business, I'm afraid, pro-profit is probably better to say, they're gonna push back.
And I think this is a related question, just in terms of whether or how difficult it is to establish liability with the manufacturers. If it's a manufacturer that's the source. It sounds like your experience, Wendy, it's been very difficult, but I don't know if other panelists have any other insights to that.
Well, New Jersey did sue manufacturers, and I think that they lost that suit, but there may be another one coming. And you know, the problem is more the other way around. The companies suing the municipalities and the state governments. But I think that there's going to be more happening, and there's a consolidated national suit that Rob Bellot's involved in, directed at manufacturers. So I think that's definitely an important way to go in the future. It's like the lead paint suit that was directed nationally at 3 major paint manufacturers. You really have to make it large and national to get the right leverage.
Great. Thanks so much, Phil. So we are at about 6 minutes for this session. And I realize, in addition to wanting more time for questions, which is probably part of what you would have liked for this session, I think just a question to all of you in terms of what additional information would be useful, or what information you hope to have more time to discuss if you are part of the December 9th session. And can either put your hand up or put that information in the chat box. And we also wanted to exhibit the polls one more time and just see if we have different responses to those over the course of this session. And so while we're taking some input in terms of additional information that would be useful to you, again, you have the link to your briefing book, which has a lot of information, and then we will follow on with some of the slides and some of the resources, excellent resources that all of the presenters provided. Great. Any comments or requests for additional information? Again, either in the chat box. I know there were some questions about understanding of the percentage of the 9,000 compounds actually used in manufacturing, what percentage of the different PFAS chemicals are still in use in manufacturing, long chain and short chain, if anybody knows that. I don't know if Laurel or Phil, you would know that in terms of given how many classes, some have been phased out or some chemicals have been phased out, but of those 9,000, I think was the statistic provided, different chemicals.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that anyone sort of has a number on which ones are long chain or short chain. Some of them are polymers, and so not the sort of smaller individual chemicals. So, and some of them I think are, you know, more proprietary in terms of their identity. So I think that's kind of a hard number to break down.
Great. So Rebecca, I don't know if you have an observation in terms of the shift in the polls, if there's been a shift at all, or any observations you want to make with the polls. And then if you could preview the session 9, because there's still opportunity to register for that session. I'm going to turn to you for that.
Yes, thank you. It does look like we have changed a little bit in percent of people thinking there might be a problem in their community with drinking water. And in terms of advancing policy options, I think we also can see a little bit of a shift and maybe some chance to talk a little bit more about that. So as we mentioned Friday, we're doing this session again. So it will be the same set of speakers, just a different group of attendees. And then on Wednesday, December 9th, at the same time, we're hosting a follow-up roundtable discussion where we'll actually have Steve Sliver from the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team and Jeff Warren from the North Carolina Policy Co-Laboratory joining our current panelists. So we'll hear a little bit from each of them about how their states have been addressing PFAS and 2 different strategies around how Michigan is doing all their testing, and then how the North Carolina General Assembly has provided funding to state researchers in North Carolina. And after we hear from them, we'll have an opportunity to also talk with and answer additional questions with Laurel, Phil, Wendy, and Sean. And then we'll actually have a bit of time for some breakout groups where we can talk a little bit more about community engagement around these topics, as well as communicating about PFAS and risk communication. So we welcome you to register for that. That registration will stay open through next week. And if there's any other questions that you have, if you didn't have a chance to get your question answered by the panelists, feel free to reach out to me and we will try to get all your questions answered. We do also have the evaluation for today's roundtable discussion. And so that was posted in the chat, as well as we'll send it to you in an email following the end of this discussion. So if there are any sort of other questions or follow-up, I thank the speakers and all of you for spending the time with us this afternoon. And again, if you have any feedback or questions, please feel free to reach out. We're here to help answer your questions.
I think Senator Charbonneau, you raised your hand, so I apologize for not going to you, and then we'll wrap up with Lisa.
Yeah, and I apologize. This just hit me, and in one of the I noticed when we talked about the harmful effects, it was there's evidence of harmful effects. And this seems to be a pervasive issue. And I'll just look at the map in Michigan. Does Michigan have more of these health problems than other states? And I guess I would like to have a clear understanding, because I used to chair the environmental committee in Indiana, so and have done a lot of work on water in Indiana. We've come a long way. And at the end of this discussion, that I can be asking this question, I guess you're going to say Ed's a pretty naive guy, but the question is there a definite, serious link to serious problems because of PFAS?
Well, I'll give a very quick answer. The study that came about from the settlement in the Parkersburg, West Virginia case against DuPont created a cohort of 69,000 people, which is far larger than almost any other environmental health cohort. And with that number of people, you can really find a lot of things you can't find out with smaller numbers, because a lot more people are going to get diseases. And they found links to 6 different diseases, including several cancers. So that really was the thing that launched a whole huge amount of research going forward. We haven't yet been able to do the research you're asking for, to say a state that's found a lot of sites, do they have a lot of diseases? And as was mentioned earlier, the reason there's so many sites that lights up on the map is because they've done more testing. And the more states that do more testing, the more will light up. So this is where we need future resources for, mainly from the federal government, to do these kinds of studies to find that out. And Laurel's involved a little bit, in that now, with the federal government doing a multi-site study. She might want to quickly say something about.
Sure. Thanks, Phil. So yeah, I'd say that we have very strong evidence of links between PFAS exposures and certain health outcomes. I think the immune system effects are clear, effects on cholesterol and metabolism. Those are some of the strongest links, and that's where we see consistency between studies in people and studies in animals. So it's not just like, you see an association in people, it could be some other factor that you can't account for. But when you see an animal study and you see something similar happen in lab animals, then that suggests there's a biological mechanism, and it seems much more plausible, and it strengthens that evidence. And there will be a lot more information coming out from a multi-site health study that ATSDR is coordinating in 7 states across the country. But even before the results of that study are available, that's going to be a few years in the making still. I would say there is strong evidence for certain health outcomes and a lot of concern about other types of health effects as well. I think one challenge is that PFAS is a really broad family of chemicals. So there are some effects that are more strongly linked just with PFAS or just with Pfoa, and we know people are exposed to a mixture. So in terms of, looking at a whole state and saying, does this state have higher incidence of certain diseases? There are a lot of other things that you would need to take into account. So probably a way to make a more conclusive link is by studying communities that have had high exposures, and so that you can have high and low people and look for differences between them. And there was just a paper that came out from Philippe Grandjean in a community in Minnesota, close to a 3M plant, where they had put in water treatment, and they were able to show that I think it was low birth weight or preterm birth. It was a birth outcome. I'm not sure exactly which one, but after they put the water treatment in and the PFAS chemical was being removed from the water, they saw a decline in low birth weight in the infants in that area. So studies like that provide an opportunity to make that linkage in studies in people. But again, I would emphasize that combining that with the lab studies in animals gives us even more confidence.
Thank you so much. That's a big question.
Thank you.
Yeah, at the very end of the session, but gives us also some insight as to what we might highlight a little bit more in on the session on the 4th. So thanks for the question. I want to turn to Lisa just to wrap up, and we'll end. And thanks so much for all of you for hanging in there for a little over our time.
Yes, great. I really enjoyed this. I've been taking all kinds of notes, and I do appreciate Senator Charbonneau's question at the end. It occurred to me that any questions that remain in the chat, those are things that we can definitely make sure get addressed on Friday's session, which you don't all have to attend again if you don't want to. But we can also return to these same questions next Wednesday, and I hope you'll join us. Like Rebecca said, there will be an email message going out shortly after this session is over with a link to register for next week. If you've already registered, you don't need to do it again, but in case you hadn't, you still have an opportunity. And then please do fill out the survey, because as you know from working with me on caucus meetings, it is super important for us to get your feedback. So I'd appreciate if all of you could take the time to fill out the survey. And with that, I think we're done, and we'll see you, I hope, next Wednesday. And please, if you did learn something today, do tell your colleagues, because we still have time to register people for Friday's session. And I believe, Rebecca, the recording will be available of this session, and you're welcome to share that when we get it posted.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.